Okay. All right. And then for the landing zone here, our landing zone is the fairway wide area extending from where a shot hits the ground. So we'll talk about this more when we get to roll, but we are assuming anywhere from 15 to 25 yards a roll, or an average of 20 yards a roll. So, and that's from that point from where it comes to rest. So for our golfer that hits it, that female scratch golfer that hits it 210, that her landing zone starts at 190. That's when the ball first hits the ground, and that's the area that we need to look at when determining landing zone. And when we look at things like topography, I guess topography is probably the biggest one, but when we look at other areas within that landing zone, we're looking at within that 20-yard range there. All right, next set of definitions is carry safely. So when we talk about carry safely, and I think we mentioned this briefly last time, was in order for us to carry an obstacle safely, a shot must be able to clear the obstacle by at least 10 yards. So when we're finding our safe carry distance, whether that's us evaluating the crossing mid-hole or the measuring team doing that prior, we're always going to take that point where the true carry is and then add 10 yards to have a safe crossing or carry in that case. And that might force a golfer to either lay up if they can't carry that water, or extreme rough, or in the case of the roll hole at St. Andrews, the building are out of bounds. Or they might have to take an alternative line of play, so they might have to play around the water in order to carry it properly. The other kind of spatial definition here is closely bordering, and that is when an obstacle or condition is considered, it's considered closely bordering if it's within 10 yards in any direction of the outside perimeter of a landing zone, or from the edge of the green. And so typically the most common application of this is when we're talking about greenside bunkers. In order for a greenside bunker to be closely bordering, or in order for a bunker to be greenside, it needs to be closely bordering the green, so it needs to be 10 yards within the edge of the green there. And we'll show you an example of one would be a greenside bunker and one wouldn't be. And then there's reference in the guide and the course rating manual to the term near, and that's when an obstacle or condition is considered near the landing zone if it's within 20 yards in any direction. And that's typically what we look at when we're determining if the fairway bunkers apply, if they're near the landing zone, so within 20 yards. So a couple pictures to kind of make them a little bit clearer. So this is the 18th hole at U of M, if any of you have been out there. But you've got your water here, and this little yellow pin here is my estimation of 10 yards beyond the water here. So our number when we're actually calculating our carry is not based on where the water ends or where the penalty area ends. It's 10 yards from that point, and that's our distance. And that's the distance that we'd use when we go to our crossing table in the book, not the actual distance to the true, quote unquote, true carry number. If I was a caddy, I would give the true carry number to this point right below. And my mouse is gone. Right. Yeah, Patty. Oh, really? Nice. 104 over from here to here.
Yeah.
Truth. Okay. Truly. Okay. Nice. But we're going to use that 10 yards. And in a lot of cases, this number is already going to be provided to you, either in the form of a crossing on your sheet, or what we call the ASL, or the approach shot length, which is basically how far it is to basically carry how far your shot is, and then you take that approach shot and minus whatever distance that number is. So let's say that you've got 170-yard shot, and on your sheet it says an ASL of 70, then you know that your carry distance is 100, because you're going to take those two numbers and subtract it, and that's how you get that number. That'll make more sense when you see a sheet and see an ASL, but that's how we measure it to get that carry. Because what we don't want is, we don't want all 7 of us out there trying to get this number, and we just want to have the number and be ready to go. But there are going to be some cases where you are going to have to actually measure a carry distance in the middle of a hole. So if this was, as an example, let's say that if this was the fairway and then the green was out of the picture here, and we had another shot beyond that, if our second shot was carrying here, then we would measure that in the course. But anything off the tee, so we have one off the tee here. This is the number 10 tee. We have a crossing here that we would measure for you off the tee, and then anything near the green we'll also measure for you. But anything in the middle of the hole, you would be responsible for getting that distance. All right, and then we talked about closely bordering. So this is just an image from Google Earth, which is an awesome tool, and just shows how, in this case here, these are made up numbers. So whatever picture this is probably not to scale, but for learning purposes, we have a distance of 7 yards from the edge to the green on that left bunker there. And then we have a distance of 12 for the one on the right. So the one on the left would be a greenside bunker. However, the one on the right would not, because it's not within 10 yards. And that's, again, something that our measuring crew will get when we're out there. But if you do have questions, or you're looking at your sheet and say, hey, there's bunkers on this hole, but how come there's nothing in my sheet that says that there's a greenside bunker? Well, it's because it might not actually be a greenside bunker, because it has to be within 10 yards of that edge of the green in order to be a greenside bunker. All right, penalty area. So a penalty area is the new term for a water hazard under the rules of golf. So the rules of golf changed last year. That where this new term, quote unquote new term, is in the book because of the rules change. But basically, it's as the thing says, any body of water on the course, whether or not it's marked, including a sea, lake, et cetera. But it also says that it also includes a ditch or a surface drainage ditch or other open water course, even if it doesn't contain water. Okay, so this, and then also any part of the golf course that the committee defines as a penalty area. So that could be heather, it could be the forest up north, the tree lined. If any of you have ever been to Polecat, they actually have the red stakes hammered into the trees there. So they play those tree lined areas as penalty areas. And so we need to rate them appropriately. Now this kind of brings up the question, and we look to the next topic, this extreme rough. Well, what happens if I'm at a golf course, and not every golf course can afford to put red stakes around every single penalty area? They just have something on their scorecard that says the tall grass areas or the heather areas are played as lateral. That's okay too, but we just need to know what area of the golf course it is. I mean, really, it doesn't necessarily matter in terms of where we're going to evaluate them, because we'll see that under the crossing and lateral here at the bottom of the page, we look at both penalty areas and extreme rough or out of bounds as the same. The only difference is that with the out of bounds, or a situation where you have to go back to where you last played from under stroke and distance, you have to apply a K adjustment in that case. So the the captain will speak with the golf course to determine how they play certain areas in the golf course, because that will impact whether that K adjustment is put on or not. But getting back to extreme rough, so this could be heather grass depending on how the course marks it, but extreme rough is a cool season rough grass, so in excess of 6 inches. It could be underbrush in trees or other conditions such as sand dunes, but not bunkers, ice plants. I'm sure some of you have seen that in other parts of the world. That's usually, I've seen that a lot in the Northern California area, not so much here, but I'm sure it's in Michigan somewhere. Maybe not. I'm not a botanist or whatever, whoever studies those. Yeah. Are there?
It can grow here.
Yeah. Palmettos, tree roots, rocks, lava, desert, heather, all this stuff that would make it likely that the ball would be lost or advance only with great difficulty. So all these things can be lumped in together as extreme rough. And then, as it says there, extreme rough should be rated under a crossing or lateral obstacles, but also could be additionally rated under R&R, or rough and recoverability, or bunkers. And that would be more if you had, like, the example I think of for the bunkers is when you have the bunkers that have that tall wispy grass surrounding it. That could be a scenario there where you have an additional adjustment looking at this. But really, we don't necessarily need to know the intricacies between what is a penalty area and what is extreme rough in terms of what it actually is. We just need to know that it gets evaluated under both lateral and obstacle, which I'll show you an example of how that would, lateral and crossing. But what we do need to know from the golf course is how they play those certain areas, because that determines if we have that K plus adjustment or not. So we have this picture again. So we have our crossing and lateral, where we look at, let me take a step back. We look at penalty areas, extreme rough, and out of bounds in both the crossing and the lateral sections or obstacles. And then here is just a pictorial example. If we're playing 18 again, we're gonna have this water that we're crossing, but then we also have the water that's lateral here as well. So we'll have not only a crossing number, but we'll also have a lateral number that we measure at the green or in our landing zone if it's not at the green. So under the old way, prior to last year, we would only count that once, because it would only count water once. But now we're counting it twice, which is more realistic, because you're actually encountering it twice. You have to cross it, and you have to worry about not missing it left. So it's more representative. And it does require us to look at these things, water, out of bounds, and extreme rough, in 2 different cases, when we cross them and when they're lateral to us. All right, any questions about that distinction there between penalty areas and extreme rough? No? Okay. All right, next is the effective playing length. So that's going to take the effective length of the course, but also have the holes corrected for things like roll, forced layups, dog legs, changes in elevations, wind, and altitude above sea level. So not all those things apply to us here in Michigan, but all those things can and do impact the length of the golf course. Some of them are going to add length. Some of them are going to subtract length. But if we look at course rating as a whole, Gene, you might have to tell me the exact numbers, but it's a very, very high percentage of the rating that comes because of the yardage.
Yeah.
It's 70+%, or what, do you know, the more than that? So it's a very, very high percentage that's determined by the yardage. So when we do these effective playing length corrections, we really want to make sure we have the pluses and minuses in the right place, because if we don't, that has a pretty negative impact on the outcome of the rating. And some of them are more intuitive than others in terms of the pluses and minuses, and others confuse people. But when we go over certain ones here, we'll get into that. When to use a plus, when to use a minus, etc. A layup. So we have another definition here, a layup. So layup comes into two different ways. We can have a forced layup, where we have a severe obstacle or a combination of severe obstacles, such as penalty areas, deep bunkers, extreme rough or severe topography causes the fairway or reduces the fairway width in the normal, crosses the fairway or reduces the fairway width in the normal landing zone of the scratch or bogey player to less than 15 yards or 13 yards for females. As a result, the player will hit less than a full shot. So this is again, the key word there is forced. So even though you might hit to an area that has a fairway width of 12, that you have to lay up. You have, by the definition, you have to lay up. So obviously that's not realistic, because the golfer doesn't take around a course rating guy with them and say, well, 12 yards up there, I think I got to lay up now. But when we're evaluating the course to come up with the numbers, that fairway width is our magic number. So if it's less than that, then we automatically are forced to lay up. Okay, and then the next one is the layup by choice. And this one, really we don't do it a ton, and it's probably a good thing that we don't do it by ton, because it's more subjective than some of the other components of course rating. But basically what this is when you have a significant obstacle that's near, but the fairway landing zone is not within that, or not that small range. So you might have a fairway width of 20, but then on one side you have water going down the entire side. So that might be a situation possibly to lay up. The layup by choice is primarily employed by scratch players. So I think a good rule of thumb is to never do a layup by choice for a bogey golfer unless someone tells you to do it, because typically a bogey golfer is never going to lay up by choice unless the situation that they're hitting into is just completely terrible. And I think in my 2 years of doing this, I think I've had one time where I think it was reasonable to have the bogey player lay up, because they were hitting into like a valley where they were going to have to hit the ball up 30 feet, and it was tilted sideways, so they would have the ball would be above their feet, they'd be hitting uphill 30 feet, and that was the only case I've ever applied a layup by choice for a bogey golfer. And it was rough, it wasn't fairway down there, it was basically just a valley that wasn't completely penalty area or water. That's the only time I've ever done it for a bogey golfer. I wouldn't recommend it for a bogey golfer ever. But for a scratch golfer, we know that scratch golfers sometimes in their course management decisions decide to lay up for certain reasons. And if it is a very narrow landing zone that they're hitting into, maybe not quite the 15 or 13 yards, but narrow, and there's other things, deep bunkers, water, etc., where they would be smart to lay up to 80 yards and hit a full wedge shot, as opposed to tighten it into a 17-yard area where you've got bunkers left and water right. Well, in that case, it probably would be something that the scratch player would do. But even in that, you want to be conservative with it, because that's still bringing a lot of subjectivity into it. And so if you're ever on the fence about what to do, we recommend that you talk to the best golfer on the group and figure out what they would do. And hopefully there's someone that is close to scratch, but that's not always the case. And if you don't have someone that is a scratch golfer that that might understand the thought process behind that golfer, then our recommendation would not be to do a layup by choice. Gene?
Yeah. What do you want to do about the case where the fairway cut ends, the closely blown area ends, and then it's just rough. There's no bunkers, there's no water, there's nothing. That would fit the definition of force. And that's the fresh golfer really.
So the question was, what happens when the fairway ends, and you're hitting to this area of rough? Maybe there's not obstacles on either side, but technically the fairway is less there, or there is no fairway there. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I don't know the exact answer on that. My thought would be that it kind of works the same way, or at least the way I was taught when you're getting the fairway numbers when you can't reach the fairway, is you just kind of assume that it's the same width of the fairway, and you make an adjustment for that. But I don't see any reason why a golfer would lay up in that case, because
and it's not a layup force layup, because it's extreme rough.
Probably isn't any place to lay up to.
right.
Yes, it does.
So I think if you're, I mean,
Bogey golfers anyways.
They're not
So-
in the fairway, they're just in rough.
What?
They're not in the fairway, they're just in rough.
That's right. It's not fairway.
Right.
It certainly is less than 13 yards.
so I think, yeah, I think in terms of, Gene, your question about, well, what happens when the fairway ends? I don't know if we have a right answer for that, other than that, hopefully that will be laid out more in the manual when we get it from the USGA. But I think, yeah.
It's going to depend on what the rough is like.
Sure.
The next shot.
Yeah, exactly. I think
shots over water, you're not going to want to be rough.
right. I think that's a good point too. Is it depends on where the state of the rough, and then also where you're going after that. Because if you're hitting into an area of rough that can be easily played from this fairway, then there's really, I mean, you just go. Right. And I don't think we would in that case, Gene, if the rough is just easily played from. But if let's say you're playing at, Oakland Hills, and the rough is 4 inches long that day for whatever reason, or it's just long in general, maybe laying up in the rough is not a good idea there, because you're not going to be able to advance your next shot the way that you'd like to. So I think there's a lot of things that go into it, but I think as a whole, we wouldn't force a layup in that scenario if the fairway ended, unless there were circumstances saying that we should. All right. So I think just in summary with this, the other thing that talks about in the layup by choice is that in order to qualify, the normal landing zone must present an unpleasant situation. And hopefully they provide some more clarification on what the heck unpleasant means, because I think that would solve a lot of these discussions that we're having, or questions that we're having, is if they laid out more scenarios than just a downhill stance or a lie to an elevated green. I think that's a good example, but that can't be the only example of an unpleasant situation where someone would lay up by choice. The other thing too, when we get to the actual section here, where layup, and we talk about putting it on the Form 1. And for those of you that don't know what a Form 1 is, that's basically the sheet that we have that we fill out, and that gets put into the computer at the end of the day. But on that Form 1, for a forced layup, we're going to put a yardage number in there. But a layup by choice, we would not put a yardage adjustment there, or we would not have a number in there for a layup by choice. We would adjust our approach shots appropriately in both cases, but we wouldn't put a number in the layup column if it was a layup by choice. All right, mounds. So now with the new terminology here, the new adjustments for R&R, we learned last week that mounds and rise and drop have been combined, but they still are defined separately here in the book. So a mound has distinct sides and slopes that impact the stance or lie. Mounds in the fairway are rated under topography. So if you have bumpy fairways, that's topography, not R&R. But mounds around the landing zones or in the green are rated under R&R. Okay, and then it says here that when considering mounds, the rating team must evaluate stance and lies on the side of mounds, the rough height, and how the mounds will impact scoring. So when I read that, or it says impact scoring, I think, well, how often are they going to come into play? So a lot of you understand the concept of, well, if you have a scratch golfer hitting a 70-yard shot to the green, the chance of them missing the green are super, super slim. So these mounds that might be 15 feet off the green or whatever, probably not going to come into play because the chances of the golfer even getting there, scratch player, need to get that on my scratch player getting there are very slim. So there are certain things to consider when we're looking at the mounds, because again, mounds is an adjustment that is shot specific. So it's got that asterisk listed.
Yes.
Patty, did you have?
So in the past, the mounds or the rise and drop around the green has always been like, that applies to everybody. But now it's going to continue to be shot specific, just like out in the fairway.
Yeah, so the question, I'm just repeating the question so that everyone online can hear as well. So the question was, so the shot or the mounds and rise and drop adjustment previously around the greens typically always applied to all golfers, whereas now, but in the fairway it was shot specific, and now it's going. I mean, it technically still is the same way, but it is shot specific even at the green too. So we as a group have made it quote unquote easier by applying it to everyone, but that's not technically the way that the book is says to do it. So we want to use some judgment.
Those ones that are a little bit questionable,
right?
So now you could give it to the bogey, but not to the scratch, because more likely the bogey's not going to be on the green than the scratch.
Sure, and I think a lot of it too is factored. I think, well, I got a picture of this accuracy pattern or the shot length too, right? Because if it could be, you have a 130-yard shot for both of those players, but for the bogey player, that dispersion is much wider at 130 yards than it is for the scratch. So I think we'll use more discretion around the greens with the mounding now, which I think will be a good thing.
Would it confuse matters by making this accuracy table then a little bit more prominent in how we rate?
Well, I think
there's some specific criteria for both scratch and bogey, and it's very specific. It's a 10-yard increment, 40 up to 250. I'm sorry, this is the other one.
Yeah. No, well, the question was about the accuracy pattern, and that is something that we'll continue to look at. But I think it'll be more front and center this year for a couple of reasons. Someone will have to tell me if the actual chart was in the old book. I don't think it was in the guide. Maybe it was, but okay, it's in the guide. So, but there's actually a much better illustration of it that was in the course rating manual, and now that the manual will be available to everyone, that it will. I think it'll be much better understood. But we're going to talk about that too. Yeah, Gene.
The problem with that accuracy table is your scratch golfers usually go into the flag, where your bogey golfers go into the center of the green. So if you've got an extreme left or right hole location, a bunker to the left side or wherever the flag is going to fall within the scratch golfers. You can't use the center of the green, or don't they take that into consideration?
So
I've never heard.
So the question was, well, typically, yeah, and I think typically the scratch player aims at the flag, Even the what's my handicap? 5.6. The 5.6 player does that too, Gene. And then the bogey, yeah, exactly. And the bogey golfer also aims at the flag all the time. But no, so I think to Tony's point is that we don't know where the whole location is going to be on a daily basis, and so we just assume that we're hitting towards the middle of the green because that's on average where the holes will be. I don't know if they address that, but
Scratch player would shift their target if there was
right.
trouble on one side or the other, so they'd compensate for it.
Right. Yeah. So I think we're just assuming that we're hitting to the middle of the green in those cases because the whole locations change frequently. But Rick, I think to get to your question, we'll definitely, it'll be more prominent for a couple of reasons, but I think that that's something that we need to consider, and especially on those shot specific adjustments, because a lot of times we're out there and we talk about, well, these trees are in here, but then you go to that accuracy chart and you're like, well, the trees are 50 yards away or 40 yards away, and they literally cannot be, by this accuracy chart, cannot be reached. So they need to be P- or lowered or whatever. And I think that that's something that we can incorporate in terms of our learning and discussion when we're out there on the green too. In terms of mounds, the hollows are basically mounds that are inverted, so those should be treated the same. Some would argue that hollows are easier because you have uphill shots, but not necessarily. Yeah, exactly.
They have nasty grass in them.
And then we have rise and drop. So this is the definition remains the same, but the rise and drop must be greater than 5 feet to qualify for this adjustment. But as we learned last week, that now we can, if we don't quite get the 5, and it's not, but before it used to be half the green, I think it was more than half the green. Now it's just a significant portion of the green. So again, that can apply to the actual playability of the green, so where the whole locations typically are. So if we have if we have a 10-foot drop behind the green on the left side of the green, but there's really only a whole location there once every week, then we don't necessarily need to apply that adjustment, or if we do, maybe we will P- it, which we'll get to in a minute, because it doesn't apply, or it doesn't come into play a ton of the time. When I say P- too, just we'll cover this in a little bit, but that is the percentage adjustment, and that's we'll cover it more, but just in case when people hear that, they don't know what we're talking about. A few other definitions here. These are interesting, to say the least. A couple of these are, but we have the punitive definition, which means an obstacle or a situation is unusually difficult and often requires a demanding recovery shot, or likely to cost a player a stroke. So I think the one way that I think about this is that whenever I have to play a shot sideways or backwards, that would be something that's punitive. But if I hit it in the trees, if I can play my shot towards the green, or on a par 5, if my punch out shot can still be advanced 150 yards or whatever, then that's not super punitive, because I'm still in good position. But if I have to play out sideways because I'm in a pine forest and there's really nowhere to swing, or I have to go back under stroke and distance, that would not be, or that would be punitive in that case. Significant is defined as sufficiently important to be worthy of attention and impacts the difficulty in playing the hole. I love how some of these definitions come up, but and this too, it won't be the first time we reference it, but it does mention the course rating system manual, which again we haven't received yet from the USGA, but we're hoping to get, and as soon as we get, we'll send out to everyone, because it'll be a digital only document. But we'll get some examples, or And what they mean by interpretation is they're actually going to provide some guidance or some examples. If you're a rules official, you're familiar with the interpretations in the rules. It'll be a similar thing. And they've even had these in the past in the course rating manual, where they have these quote unquote decisions that are now called interpretations. And they'll just provide some examples, some concrete examples of what would be significant. And then likewise in these next two, what would be a toggle and what would be a tweener. A toggle, which a lot of you that have done this for a while know what this is, but it's when we alternate rating values or the application of an adjustment when there are multiple instances that maybe don't quite reach that 1 point adjustment. And so we might toggle it. And what that means is that the next time we see something similar, we'll apply it at that hole. And so typically we do this with R&R a lot with the mounds, where it maybe doesn't quite get to that level where we'd adjust a 1. But if we have 2 of those holes in a row, then we would apply it on one of those holes and call it a toggle. And then a tweener is a value that falls between 2 table values. So if you see a table and you have, in the example here, values 4 and 6, you could use a tweener, which would get you to a 5 there. The previous most common example of this was the tweener that we used in the topography section, but now that they've put that row in the chart, there's no longer a tweener for topography. So we'll have to see what our next most used tweener will be in 2020, because it won't be topography, but I'm sure we'll have, there are scenarios. I'm trying to think, I think we did, I think it was at Fern Hill. I don't know, Bob, if you, I think you're on the call, Bob, maybe, I think we did a tweener at Fern Hill for something, didn't we? Sorry to put you on the spot. Maybe you don't have the audio. But I'm pretty sure we did one there. I think everyone that was rating this in this room, or did we do something? Didn't we do a tweener at Fern Hill?
Kyle?
Yeah, Bob. There you are.
No, this is Ken.
Oh yeah, Ken. Yeah.
Typically, tweeners apply in trees.
Okay. Yep. That's a good. Yeah, you're right. That's a good example. Where you have some ranges there. Yeah, you're right. That will definitely be the most common tweener for sure. And if people have a book, the trees chart is on 35, or your old book, you'll see the same thing. But you'll see that for that 2-shot hole, we've got tweeners galore there between 2 and 4, 4 and 6, and 6 and 8. So yeah, good point there, Ken. Thanks for the assist. All right, and then a last couple of these definitions is shoot. We won't get into the specifics of this, but that shoot table is now under 35, on page 35, and it's basically just as it sounds like. We use it for trees, and when we have a shoot of trees, so on the left and the right side, that we'll have an adjustment that we'll make there depending on how wide that opening is and how far the shot is that we're hitting into the shoot. And we have an obstacle squeeze, which occurs when lateral obstacles are present on both sides of a landing zone, and a player cannot play away from either side. Rating values and tables assume that the existence of some obstacle squeeze. However, we basically any upward adjustment of those table values is warranted when the obstacle squeeze consists of lateral obstacles that are situated on both sides of a landing zone and are less than 40 yards apart. And then we can also have an obstacle squeeze for bunkers when they're less than 30 yards apart. So if we look at an example here, we have a bunker squeeze here because we have our total distance is 29 yards, so it's less than 30. So we'd have a Q adjustment for bunkers. in this example. And you could have the same would be the case if you had water on both sides of the hole, or extreme or out of bounds and water on one side of the hole. But Gene brought up a good point before we started was, well, what happens if you have bunkers on one side and then water on the right? Well, those aren't two of the same in terms of that definition. They're not both lateral. It specifically mentions lateral, and then it specifically mentions bunkers. So in that combination, as far as I understand, there'd be no squeeze adjustment in that case.
But it doesn't say they don't have, both obstacles have to be the same anymore.
Yeah.
It implies it because it's on each individual page.
Yeah, I think it does. It doesn't talk about a scenario, and I think it's probably, yeah, like Gene, as you were saying, because they're on their specific pages, and it doesn't really talk about when you have a cross.
The bunker page actually says bunkers that border both sides.
Right.
Squeeze.
Right.
Well, the other one does too. It says if obstacle squeeze occurs because the distance between the lateral obstacles that border both sides.
Right. Yeah. So Gene
One of the
Gene
others
looked in both, and
Okay.
it's
Okay.
in both of the sections. It talks about only lateral obstacles and only bunkers. So if you have a combination, you would not have an adjustment applied.
Which is inconsistent. In theory.
Which Rick says is inconsistent, which is another adjustment.
Well, I mean, you're gonna get a
I'm just
rating
kidding.
for the lateral. and
Yeah.
You're gonna get a rating for the bunker.
Yeah,
So you're sort of getting it.
yeah. I think
It's
Patty, to
really
your
sort of
point.
be doubling down if you get it.
Yeah.
for The squeeze too.
I think that's a good point, and Patty's
And if it's less than, if it's narrow, then it could always be a layup.
right. As Patty was saying, is that if it's the same obstacle, you're not counting it on both the left and the right side, so you're only getting one measurement. Whereas if you have a bunker on one side and a water on the other side, you're evaluating it for both, and you're getting multiple ratings for that. So if you did combine it, you would well, it wouldn't be inflated. It would be that it's already being taken into consideration because you're looking at two separate things. Whereas if it's the same thing, you have that additional adjustment up because you're only evaluating it once.
Okay, well, but a bunker's an obstacle, but that's not the same as a lateral obstacle.
Lateral obstacle versus a
obstacle is
bunker.
what we
Yeah.
used to call water.
Right. Yeah.
So if you have OB on one side and water on the other,
Now you can have the squeeze.
now you can have squeeze.
Right.
So Jean's comment, I don't know if it was a comment or question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jean's thinking out loud, but she said if you have OB down the right side and water down the left side, you could have a squeeze adjustment in that case because they're both lateral obstacles, but they do have to be less than 40 yards apart.
That's my.
No, 30 for bunkers, 40 for other things.
Water, a bunker, or out of bounds. Water and out of bounds. And the target area is constant regardless of what those perimeter obstacles are. The concept is you're trying to address it's a tighter shot than normal, or it's at
Right.
risk for these perimeter obstacles.
Right, but so in Rick's comment was, well, you're still hitting to a narrow target, but I think the way that we can think about this is, okay, so if we have a bunker on one side and water on the other, we're gonna get our number for our water, which would be the same if it was both, right? And then for the bunker, we're gonna get that Y, is it still the Y adjustment for a fairway bunker? So we're gonna have a +1 there. So if we have water versus a bunker, our table or our outcome is going to be the same number.
So that again, evaluating for each of the two obstacles, if we were to add squeeze, we would be inflated.
Yeah.
If you have.
If you did squeeze on top of
Right.
a bunker and a water, yes, right. Yeah. So yeah, you'd be double counting in that case, which is why it only applies when it's two bunkers or multiple bunkers or multiple lateral obstacles.
Those are extreme bunkers. There's so many.
All right. Next one here is waste area. And we kind of went over this definition because this is a new one, but now it's in there. So we won't spend too much, we won't really go over it again, but just the key thing in terms of applications that waste areas may be rated as R&R or recoverability in rough, and bunkers or extreme rough, depending on the situation. So it's not always cut and dry with waste areas. Luckily, we don't deal with a ton of those in Michigan, but when they do, we will figure out what obstacle to rate them under. Definition of a tier. So we touched on this last week a little bit, but the tier is going to be taken care of by the measuring crew when they go out there. However, it's still something that we need to look at because we will apply it in the green target obstacle as well as the green surface. So it does apply in both cases. And basically, in order for a green to be tiered, a green must have a minimum of 2 distinct plateaus of surface area, and each with multiple available hole locations. So that picture from last week that we showed where that one little shelf that had one hole location, that doesn't apply as a tier because there's only one hole location up there and it doesn't get used frequently enough for us to qualify that. And then it needs to be separated by a 2 foot or greater elevation difference, which for me, it's always difficult to picture 2 feet because whenever I see a quote unquote ramp, I always think it's a tier, but it's not. 2 feet is fairly substantial if you think about it, like on a green. And so even though something might look like a tier, it does have to rise more than 2 feet. And then the elevation change must include, let's see, where am I at here? And the elevation change must include a significant portion of the green. Okay, and again, that's in relation to playability, not necessarily size as it was previously. And then if we have 2 plateaus with 1 ramp, that equates to 2 tiers. If we have 3 plateaus with 2 ramps, we're getting super crazy greens here. U of M is a good example where we have 2 ramps that equates to 3 tiers. And then the other key thing here is that a ball will not normally remain at rest on a ramp between the 2 tiers. So if you can get a ball to stick on that ramp, then it's not really a tier. But luckily for us, for most of us mirror raters out there, we don't need to worry about the tier. That's something that the measuring crew takes care of. We can argue with them when we get there, but typically we just take it and go with it because 99 times out of 100 they're right. A few other definitions that we don't necessarily need to worry too much about. Desert, we don't, at least to my knowledge, there's none of those in Michigan. I don't know, maybe somewhere in I haven't been, but we don't have to worry about that. And then the grasses, cool or warm grasses. So we're typically in the cool grasses. So when I was reading through the definition, if you go to look at the definition, it talks about the different types of grasses. And I'll be honest, I read this and I had a panic attack yesterday because there was a mention of bent grasses and how those are warm season grasses. And I was like, oh my gosh, we've been doing this wrong the entire time. But then I quickly texted every superintendent I know and asked them what their rough was, and they all said it was Kentucky bluegrass. So, but that is a question that we will need to ask the superintendent to be sure on, because I know that there probably are some clubs in Michigan that do have bent grass rough. Probably not many, but and especially around the greens, you might see that more than the actual rough or the outside the fairways.
And you could do that and be consistent with that. something
Right.
like that when they're out there.
Right. Yeah. So
Because that is horrible to get out.
yeah. So Patty was saying that if you did have that, maybe just around the greens, that you could, apply an adjustment if it was just around the greens and not necessarily all around the golf course. But that would be something that I'll work with the captains to make sure that we have that communication with the golf course, because I can't say with certainty that all the golf courses in Michigan don't have bent grasses, but technically speaking, if they do have bent grass roughs, then we do need to use the warm grass, which is, if you are familiar with the way the book works, it's that second level that's in brackets that would basically bump up the numbers 1 for everything. So I did have a minor panic attack yesterday. I was thinking that Jean led me astray for so long, but luckily she never did that. So the other definition in here is this definition of mid-season, and so that includes all months of the year when a golf course is regularly maintained and scores are being posted for handicap purposes. So that mid-season form for us here in Michigan is April 1st to October 31st. That's our score posting season. So we as a habit, or as a matter of principle or whatever you want to call it, we only rate golf courses from April 1st to October 31st. So even if the course calls us afterwards, if we have a nice day, we won't do the rating outside of that time frame. Because that's the book tells us that we should only rate during that time frame, and we don't want to get. And obviously, we can all sit here and say, well, is April 1 really mid-season? Because we know that April 1 is significantly different than July 1. But at the end of the day, if we have, there's 915 18-hole equivalent golf courses in Michigan. We don't rate them all, but if we did rate them all, we couldn't do every golf course in July on a 10-year cycle. That'd be impossible. So there are certain times that we are going to have to do them in quote unquote shoulder seasons, but we'll talk with the golf course and figure out what the normal playing conditions are so that we can adjust our numbers for any rough that might not be fully grown in, or trees or things like that. So we get the full effect there.
And do it during the time when the course is covered in leaves.
All right, and then the last one here is it's in there is line of play, and that's just straight from the rules of golf, but it's not super important for our intents and purposes. I mean, obviously it matters, but that's another one that's in there. Next is section 3. So when we talk about our shot information, so as we talked about before with the bogey and the scratch player, we have our shot charts or shot lengths. You can see in this chart here, that's in your book. If you don't have the book, it took a screenshot here. We have our scratch male golfer that hits it 250 with 20 yards a roll. So we have 20 yards assumed roll here. And then if we go over to the next column, where our female is at 210 and all the way throughout, you can see that that's for the tee shot. And then after that first shot, our subsequent shots have different distances, and that makes sense, right? One kind of tip that I think everyone does here after they get the hang of things, and once you get your Form 1 sheet on that morning, a lot of people will go down, and if that final approach shot, let's say it's a par 5 or a multi-shot hole where they're not reaching the green in 2, they'll go in and they'll write their landing zone yardages so that when they're out there, they can go to the proper place. So if you have, let's say, for example, a 500-yard hole, on your sheet, it's going to have a number for, let's just assume a male scratch golfer. Let's assume my math is going to be good here. You're going to have on your sheet, on the approach shot, a 30-yard shot. But you know that you need to go and evaluate what it looks like from 250 yards away and then at 30 yards away as well. So a lot of people will on the bottom there write down what distances they need to go to or landing zones they need to go to, so that they're not having to do the math while they're out there on the course. That's a good tip, to do all that math before you go out. And then I think we always get the question, how did the USGA come up with these numbers? And does the scratch golfer really only hit at 250 yards? I'm not on the high enough pay grade to be able to answer that question. So we just evaluate what the USGA gives us, and that's what they say is how far the scratch golfer hits it. And they constantly look at the data to reevaluate if they need to adjust it. And I'm sure there's been lengthy discussions over the last 5 to 10 years about possibly adjusting it, but has not been adjusted. And I don't know for anyone that's been doing it longer than I have, how long have these numbers been in use? As long as, yeah. Gene, do you
They've been
recall?
around forever. The definition was different. Used to be the entire field at the men's US amateur.
Okay,
Then it became the match play qualifiers.
right. So, but as far as you remember, that 250 has been,
Always
yeah, yeah. So,
Their new report is much more specific if you have a week to read it, because the summary is, I think, 18 or 19 pages.
the
All
distance
they have
report,
said
yeah.
In principle is, we've got something that we should study,
Okay,
but there are just table after table of specific events, specific classes of golfers when they've tracked it.
right.
Unlike what you had before, where all of a sudden the scratch players evaluated by some 200 rounds. And some of the frequency tables.
Year after.
You wouldn't want to take to a statistics theory class.
Right.
They're so
Yeah.
minuscule.
Okay.
The numbers.
Yeah. So Rick was just saying that the USGA recently released this distance insights report, and they had some decent data in there and showed where they gathered the data, and that's kind of the basis of where they get these numbers from. But it's something that they're looking at.
I think there was a shot across the bow and they're waiting for the response back from the PGA and the
Right.
manufacturers.
Right. Yeah. So as far as we, it doesn't really matter, I guess, technically what the number is, just that there's a set number that we use, that all raters, golf course raters use across the world now. And that those are the numbers. All right. This is probably a fairly complicated topic here. So if you get lost on this one, join the crew here, because this is one that is a bit tricky and also a little new in terms of how it's being done. So this transition zone is the area close to or on the green that is just beyond the average distance a scratch or bogey player can expect to hit it with consistency. So on a one-shot hole, our transition zone is 10 yards. And on a two-shot or more hole, the transition zone is 20 yards. So no matter, and you'll see what this will look like here in a second. We've got an example on our sheet when the transition zone comes up. But when you see that TZ on your sheet, as long as we're using this transition zone concept, we are going to use the green target 50-50 transition zone rating value that's listed in that green target chart. Okay, so that's at the bottom of the chart, and we're going to use that regardless of if we talk about this more than 50 or less than 50% of the time. We're going to use that number as our green target. Okay, and then once the rater has determined the green target value, then the following process is used to rate topography, fairway, crossing, lateral, and trees. So if the player reaches the centre or center of the green 50% or more of the time on the long shot, rate the hole using that shot for the approach shot information. the player is short of the center of the green more than 50% of the time, assign an area 10 yards short of the front of the edge of the green as a landing zone, from where the approach shot would be played, and rate the hole using that area for approach shot information. So this doesn't impact the green target at all, just impacts what we look at under topography, fairway, crossing, lateral, and trees.
Can you show us examples?
Yep.
10 years later, I'm as confused as
Yeah. Yeah. So the question was an example. So so first, before we get to the example, we have to also determine, in that determining 50%, we are going to look at certain things. We're going to look at roll, we're going to look at elevation, we're going to look at dog leg, any forced layups, and any obstacle preventing a shot from reaching the green. So if we have a bunker that's right in front of the green, then obviously we know that there's very little chance that the golfer gets there because it's going to go in the bunker. Not only can these affect whether it's 50% more or less, but it also could impact whether we even get into the transition zone at all. So I'll show you an example here. But here's this picture that we had last week. We have, maybe it didn't, okay, there it is. So we have a scenario where we hit it to B1, and then our B2 is our next landing zone. And in this case here, we're going to assume that we're getting there less than 50% of the time. So this B2 is our 10 yards short of the front of the green. And then we're going to evaluate our obstacles at this point, but we're still going to use the green.
How did you say 50% less than 50%?
Yeah, so that part, so the question was, how do you determine the 50%? And that part is really subjective. It's not super cut and dry, but you're going to use certain things like the roll, the elevation, anything that might make it easier or harder to get to that. So I think the best way is to show an example here. So if we have a hole that's 303, or sorry, in this case, a par 5, it's 553 yards. Okay, so our first shot for a male bogey golfer goes 200, and then we have 170 for our second shot, and that leaves us with 183 yards. So that 13-yard window is within that 20 yards of the transition zone. So we have that TZ shows up on our sheet. So we have the first situation where our elevation tee to green is minus 160 feet, pretty significant. Okay, and then we're gonna make the assumption that the golfer is going to get to the middle of the green more than 50% of the time. And the reason for that being that maybe it's not all at the approach shot 160 feet down, but at some point in time, that golfer is going to benefit from the hole being downhill, and especially when they get to the green, they're going to benefit. So that shot is going to get there more often than not. Okay. And then we also can see that this 13 here is, it's on the higher side of that 20-yard transition zone, because it would also be a transition zone if it was 173. And that would be another thing that you'd want to consider as well, is that the closer you are to the front of that range, the more likely the player is to get to that green. Whereas the closer you are to the back of the range, maybe not so much. But in this case, we're going to assume that they're going to get there because of the elevation. But we could look at roll, a lot of different things. So if we do that, for those of you that have the book, I can walk you through it. But if you go to the green target chart, you'd have your 50-50 transition zone rating value for a effective green diameter. So up here is 22. And if you don't know how to read the chart yet, we'll have someone explain it to you after we're done. But you basically go to that column 4 there, and then go down to the 50-50, and that gets you to number 5. And then for R&R, we're going to assume 2.25 inch rough. Okay, so then for R&R, we go and we get to our column, and then we look at our green target value for bogey offer is 5, and that gets us an R&R target of 5.
Okay.
Yep.
If the golfer will get there more than 50% of the time, then wouldn't you be raising that target to a 6? Wouldn't you be plussing it? Because the target's higher because he gets there more often?
No. So we're not going to adjust the green target. It says in here that you can, and we're not. It says maybe adjusted, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We'll get into that specifically potentially later on, but right now we're just assuming that we're just going to go ahead and just use that 50-50 value as given and not make any adjustments on the green target. And then we go to our bunkers. Our bunker, we use that green target value of 5, and we are in column 2 for our bunker. So those of you that are familiar with this is our column here on the sheet. And then it's greater than 3, so we have a +1 adjustment. So that takes us from a 4 to a 5, gets us to a 5. And then our lateral here, we're going to use our approach shot length. So in this case here, we're going to use this 183 to get our lateral number. And 183, when it's 28 away, is a 5.
So we don't use the actual shot length, but we use the maximum amount, even though it's beyond what they can actually hit.
Aren't for the level you averaging the short and the long?
No, because we're not. That's the old way of doing it. So in this case, Gene, we're assuming that the player is going to get to the green, so we're only making one lateral observation, and we're using that 183 yards to determine what that number is.
Get to the green or get to the center of the green is one part of the question. And then is it carry or carry and roll that you judge?
So in terms of getting to what number? Yeah. So the approach shot distance is all based to the middle of the green.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But that in itself can include roll.
Can include roll. Yes, it does include roll. Yes.
So a golfer may not reach the center of the green if there's obstacles that stop the ball from rolling to the center of the green.
Correct.
You made a point about a reference of something I missed it. 10 yards. There's 10 yards short of the center of the green.
No, of the front of the green. So let's stay with this example here. In this example, we're assuming that the golfer is going to get to the center of the green more than 50% of the time. Okay, so in this case, we don't have to worry about that 10 yard. If we thought it was going to be less than 50% of the time, then we would go 10 yards short and do our evaluation there. So I think the key is that we're using this 183 yard number to get our lateral. Okay, and then the second situation, and this is one where it could take us out of the transition zone completely, where we have, in this case, we're going to assume that effective plane length reduces the hole by 15 yards of roll. So on that, Rick, to your point, roll can impact where the ball ends up. So we're saying that because it's 160 feet downhill and where the ball hits the ground, there's whatever the term is, significant, whatever, and we're going to gain 15 yards from that. So the ball's going to roll 15 yards further than normal. So now all of a sudden that 183 turns to 168. And now at 168, we don't have a transition. And so that will take us out of transition completely.
I guess I don't understand why
I don't understand why you wouldn't
the
gain
golfer will get to the middle of the
instead
green.
of a 160-foot downhill shot.
Well,
Oh.
he's saying that zoning,
Should be up and
that where the ball lands
Hold on.
on that elevation. So it's not on.
You're going the wrong direction. You're going the wrong direction. If you get the green more than
Yeah.
it's easier when you lower the target.
No,
Yeah.
no, if he's short of the green, you've lowered the target.
No,
Yeah,
no, the other way. If it's short of green, means you can't get there. It's
I
harder.
know.
Right,
But
yeah.
then he's coming in a short shot.
Yeah.
And it's much easier.
Well, yeah.
That's
So his
true.
green target's
Right.
gonna be lower.
Yeah. So we're,
Right. And if he's getting there more than 50% of the time, it's harder. So if the green target's gonna be
Yeah.
higher than
Yeah.
that 50% average.
yeah. So
Doesn't, yeah, that's what I said all along.
so the discussion in here is just about this minusing the green target or adjusting the green target. And right now, there's been talk internally about how we're going to do this. And what we've been talking about is that, well, if we adjust it up in one case and adjust it down in the other case, does this just complicate matters? And if we just didn't do any adjustment, all else equal, it's going to balance out and be the same. So there's discussion on how we're going to do this, because we want it to be not only correct but also as easy as possible to apply. So we'll have some more guidance on this whole +1 -1 for the green target. But for now, we just want to go into the assumption that the green target value is going to be that bottom row number for now.
We're going to use the transition zone, the bottom row, the 55th. Okay,
Mhm.
look on top of page 5. It says, because R&R and bunker depend on the green target rating, applying the average green target rating to the R&R table or green side bunker means no further averaging is required for R&R and bunkers. I get that. Then they proceed to tell you not to average for any of the others.
Sorry, Gene, you lost me on your.
Yeah, because you're averaging on the transition zone, you're averaging the green target.
Right.
Or you're averaging R&R and bunkers.
Right. Yep.
Now, the next paragraph, they say, now make a decision whether he's gonna make it or not and rate everything else that way.
Yep.
So it's exactly opposite.
So well, basically what it's it's saying that you're not going to average
And any of the
any of this other stuff, and that the green target has been averaged for you with that column, but you're not going to average as before.
topography, fairway, crossing, lateral retreat.
You're just going
Yes, you
to
do, because they get averaged. Because
Yeah, you're
they're
just-
using the green, because they use the transitions of
They
the
get-
green target are based.
yeah.
Bunkers and R&R.
Right,
So they're
okay, but you're
already
not
averaged.
physically doing it, you're just
No.
using the target.
Yep. So before, the correct way was to get the two different types and average them together, and there was probably like 7 people across the state that did it right, if that. I definitely didn't do it that way, because that was just a pain in the neck, and maybe I got to the same number or one off or whatever. But so now, as Gene, you said, you don't average any of the other things, the crossing, the laterals, the trees, the topography. That's all either based on that full approach shot length or the 10-yard short,
Yeah.
and you evaluate it there. Yep. Yep. Gene says it's weird for anyone that Mike, yeah.
For somebody that knows nothing. If I get on situation 2, if I get an extra 15 yards of roll, so I've got a closer third shot.
Mhm.
If I'm gonna add up all the values for what we've computed here in 1 and 2, in the first example, we've got 20 for all those numbers, and we've got 23 and 2. To me, that means that if I've got a better chance of getting the distance there because I don't have a transition in 2, it's still making the hole harder for me. Well, in other words, I've got higher values in situation 2 for rating,
Right.
which normally means that it's a harder hole.
Right. I think the reason that the numbers are higher in the second one is because we're assuming that we're getting there. And so in the first one, there's a built-in average, as Gene was saying, with the green target, the bunkers, and the R&R, because sometimes we're getting there and the other times we're not. So it's kind of, sometimes we have the 183-yard shot and the other times we have a 10-yard pitch shot. And so it's kind of averaging that. So I think that's why the second value is higher, because we're 100% getting there, because it's within our number. Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, it I guess the way, I mean, Gene, I think you always use this example with me when you were, I mean, a lot of times too, if you think about this as well, like, Gene played at Oakland Hills, and that's where she learned to play or whatever. And she always used to say, "Oh, it's a driver 3-wood wedge, driver 3-wood wedge." Well, sometimes it's a lot easier hitting a wedge into a green than your 6-iron or your 4-iron. And I think that's really what we're looking at here. Whereas in some cases where we're wedging in, or we're hitting chip shots as opposed to full shots every single time. And even though it's a quote unquote one more shot, it brings less things into play when you're hitting a shorter shot.
Okay.
So.
Well, you don't have as much roll to the shorter shot.
Well, correct. Yeah. Cause we're only looking at roll for full shots. We only evaluate roll for full shots, but yeah.
And then
That
two
was-
paragraphs give us an out.
What are the next two paragraphs say, Gene?
Because of roll or dogleg or whatever.
Right.
If it takes it out or puts it in the transition zone, you have all kinds of reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that will, I think this whole transition zone concept is something that we will learn good ways to apply it, and to make it as, I don't want to say as easy as possible, because we want it to be right, but we'll find happy mediums or come up with situations where we will do one thing, and to just to make it more applicable. But it's definitely not it wasn't an easy concept before. It was misdone before, it was misapplied before, and it's maybe gotten a little easier, but it's going to continue to be misapplied going forward. So luckily we don't run into a ton of these transition zones on the golf course where we have this thing, but there are some outs, as Gene was saying, and that was kind of the example, or the situation too, where roll took us out of the transition completely.
Right, in both directions.
Right.
You're not gonna make it or make it.
Right. Yeah. And you could have a shot that's just straight uphill, and roll could prevent you from even having a chance. Or, as I think Rick mentioned, you got a bunker that runs through the middle of the green, or not the middle of the green, but in front of the green. Well, no matter how much you roll, you're not going to get through the bunker.
Well, and we've got a lot of greens have that little dip right in front of the green.
Right.
And when your ball hits there, it's not rolling.
Yep.
So that's just,
Right. So yeah, it's going to be a tricky subject, and I think that we will continue to do best to educate, and to get it right. But there are so many different factors that could move it from transition to out of transition, or from out of transition into transition. That is definitely going to make it a little bit more complicated, and we don't necessarily want to make it too complicated, because at the end of the day, we talked about this earlier, but yardage is such an important factor in the rating that all the other obstacles, I don't want to say they're insignificant, but they're not as important as the yardage. So whether we're off a point or two on transition zone, on the one hole that we have a transition zone on, it's not really going to make that big of a difference at the end of the day.
Kyle,
Yes.
this is Leroy. One of the things I want to mention is, for us that are participating in the ratings, these transition zones are already going to be decided. They're already going to be on our Form 1 sheets, right? So when we have our discussion at the green. I mean, it's already been decided if it's a transition zone or if it's not a transition zone.
Well, so that's kind of true. It'll be on your sheet, but as we have this example on the page here, is that right now it's assuming that our approach shot is 183 yards, but there could be things that would change that approach shot length, and whether if we go up 8 yards and we get out of that 20-yard range, then we're no longer in transition, or if we go down 14 yards, or in our case here, 15 yards, we move out of that transition. So, yeah, yes and no. 7 times out of 10, it's going to be right on the sheet. And those other 3 times are ones that you're either going to move out of transition or you're going to move into transition possibly. So it's unfortunately, it's not as cut and dry as we'd all like it to be. But does that make sense,
Yeah.
Leroy?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. That makes sense because we have those discussions on the greens with the
Right.
captains and everybody when we get there, and
Right.
that's what you're talking about. When those exceptions will be made.
Yeah, and I think that the big thing on this is that these transition zones don't come up that often, and when they do, we can talk through them and make sure we get them somewhat right. As long as we're in the same, or the same ballpark, we're good. We just don't want to put down 2s when they should be 6s, and 6s when they should be 2s.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So when we go back to this example of we have our 10-yard short, and I'm just more thinking this through than anything. So when we have our 10-yard short, we're going to have our green target value that's determined by that bottom row. And then in terms of our obstacle values, instead of using that 183-yard shot, we're just going to evaluate at that point how far away the penalty areas are, how far, or what the topography is, if there are any crossings at that point. That's the new number that we'd have to do, or we'd have to evaluate at. And then I'll have to get clarification on this, so maybe someone in the room could think or answer it out. But so let's say, for example, in our 183-yard example, we assume that they're not going to get there, so we put them 10 yards short of the front of the green. And I think someone asked a question about this, about the green depth too. So let's say we put them 10 yards short and the green is 20 yards, I don't know, whatever. So to make math easy. So from the front of the green back 10 yards plus 10 yards. So that then our approach shot, technically our approach shot is 20 yards, or 20 yards left to the middle of the green. So then for that shot that we hit in, I know this is getting a little technical, I'm losing some people, but if we hit from 183, now we take off 20, and that's 163. So if we had a crossing, we would use that number, and that's a question mark. I would think that's how it would be applied. And if, I don't know, Gene, do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I agree.
Okay, Gene agrees with me, so that's good. But yeah. But so we have to get more clarification on exactly how that works. But I believe that if you followed the madness in my head there and the math on the fly, I believe that's how that would be applied. And then we look at our distances from that 10 yards short of the green to get our lateral numbers, et cetera. All right. Our accuracy pattern here. So Rick brought this up earlier, and this chart's in the book. Sorry, the chart is in the book, but the picture from the old manual was too good for me not to use, because it's much more visually, I guess, just a much better visual. But the accuracy table, just getting a step back here, It determines the areas into which a scratch or bogey player is expected to hit shots of various lengths 67% of the time. So not 100% of the time, but 2/3. And it's used to assist in evaluating the effect of obstacles around the target. So you can see here that this is our dispersion pattern that's based on the data that the USGA has put together. And you can see that for scratch golfers versus bogey golfers, we have different dispersions, both length and width-wise as well. But these numbers, as far as I know, are still the same in the current book. And again, this is something that we talked about. We will use to evaluate how much of an impact certain obstacles have. So if we look at, we just use an example here. We have, get my mouse here. We have on the, let's just say on the right here, female golfer, and our scratch golfer, so the one in dark hits or in black here, hits a shot from 80, I think that says, no, 60, sorry, 60, I think it's 60, right? Yeah, so 60 to the middle. So on 60, her dispersion from left to right is a pretty tight range of five yards in either direction, so 10 yards. And so if we were looking at things around the green, so mounds or whatever, for example, and we would probably never apply a mounds adjustment for a golfer that had that shot length in, because they literally, unless the green is really narrow, they're not going to miss the green. So that would be a scenario where we may not apply an M plus there, but if we move up to hitting 180 yard shot, then our dispersion is much wider. And so therefore we would be more inclined to put that M plus in there, because those mounds off the green are going to come more into play.
So is this a little tool that we have with us? This chart literally to help take out subjectivity of whether we think here's criteria that we're supposed to follow, just like we're stuck with this 250 yards.
Yeah, I mean the charts in the guide. So it's in there. Just unfortunately it's not visual like this, but it is, that chart is in, it's on page 5 if you have a manual or a guide.
Scratch woman golfer hitting 210 yards. That doesn't make any sense.
It's a full. Yeah, it's just over. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's just the way they organized it. Yeah, because that's they have the bogey golfer and scratch golfer separate on that table. But yeah, so I think, Rick, to your point, that this is something that we should look at, or I don't know if we necessarily need to evaluate it for every obstacle, but especially when we get around landing zones or around the green, that's something to be
obstacle values that we plus because of these rising drops or mounds.
right.
There's a lot of subjective conversations.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, we can definitely use this as a guide in terms of taking the subjectivity out of it. But at the same time, I think one of the fears of using this for everything is that it's paralysis by analysis.
In and of itself, it's a tool that people would have to be oriented in and understand how they would apply it.
Right. Yeah. So I think
5 and 6 people who might not agree whether we should mound the green or there's an adjustment for rise and drop are all looking at it technically from different perspectives, because their approach shots are coming from different distances.
Right. Correct. Yeah. Because everyone is essentially evaluating different golfer, different spots. And I think that's one thing too, that we tip, if you open up the front page of the book or the guide, even in the old one, I think it says the same. It's the number 6 in the new one, but it says, it basically says don't talk about the obstacles until the team leader gets in. I think that's the rationale behind that message. Not, we don't always do that because I think it's not necessarily great advice, because there are some things that we gather by talking around the green. But there are certain things that could lead people astray if they're not thinking about their own golfer, but they're thinking about something that I said that applies only to my golfer.
Well, I think that since it's become shot specific at the green, that, you have to give the people the guidelines, and then you're gonna have to trust the rater to put down the right numbers, as you do anywhere else.
I don't think bunkers are shot specific at the green.
No, I didn't say bunker.
Well,
I'm
or
talking
are
about
either,
mounds.
because the boat mounds, all of that is determined by the target. If they're there, they're there. Now, obviously, your landing areas are different, so they're shot specific out there. You could have mounds in your scratch landing area and not in your boat, but they're there in the green. And just because they're your scratch golfers coming in from 20 yards, I don't think you take the M away at the green.
All right. Well, I'm going to heavily disagree with you on that one.
Built into the table that he's shooting from a close.
Yeah, that's part of the fact that bunkers are determined by his green target.
Right.
You,
All right. Well, we'll have to look and see. I mean, everything I read says that mounds are shot specific, and it doesn't
Shot to the
say.
green or tee shot. I agree. On the tee shot, they have different landing areas.
Right.
They all have the same landing area at the green, and if the bunkers are there, if the mounts are there, you count them. I don't think you can just discount him because he's not going to hit them.
Mm-hmm. We'll have to get further clarification on that because, yeah, I talked to Lee yesterday about something else, but I'll ask. But I'm pretty sure that they're shot specific everywhere, and that you have to evaluate the accuracy of the shot coming in. But we'll leave it open to interpretation that it applies equally. Because I mean, the way I look at it is that there's no way that you can justify someone that has a 20-yard pitch shot gets the same adjustment as someone that hits a 180-yard 3-iron. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
The target's a 2 and a 6.
The target is, but the adjustment is one for both of them.
The target's already gonna bring your table number way down.
The target's going to account for that, but the adjustment's still one either way.
I know, but
Yeah. I think
always
it's
been that way. I know that you're thinking like a scratch golfer, and I'm not.
scratch. No, I'm thinking like a scratch player.
Player,
Yeah.
Scratch players, the point you have to take both perspectives if you want a realistic evaluation.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think we look at
Lower the number in the first
Right.
place, so there are amounts, because if I mean, even a scratch golfer can hit a bad shot and end up where it doesn't want to be.
right.
You see it every weekend.
Yep. Yeah. So no, we'll get further clarification on that. And if certain things are shot specific only in certain cases, or if they're just generically shot specific.
I think you and I
So.
have different definitions of shot specific. Everybody's got a shot to the green. Everybody has a tee shot. Everybody doesn't have a second shot.
Right. Okay. Well, there's no point in us arguing about it now. We'll get it settled.
It's on record.
Why don't they have a
It's on
definition
record.
of shot specific?
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's more, clarification in the manual when it comes out on that. All right. Onwards. Obstacles don't exist. So if an obstacle is more than 50 yards to the left or the right of the line of play and more than 50 yards beyond the center of the green, generally it should not be considered a factor for either the scratch or bogey player, i.e. it doesn't exist on the hole. It should be rated 0. Obstacles less than 50 yards from the center of the fairway or the center of the green exist on the hole and should be rated at least a 1, even if not near a landing zone. So this concept applies to bunkers, lateral obstacles, crossing obstacles, and trees. So there are a few examples of this, does not exist for crossing and lateral on page 6 in the course rating guide if you're interested in looking at them. But for those of you that remember, if you had that sticker on your book from last year, that's what this is basically just, if you have a crossing value that's a 0 by the table, when you go to your table and you get a 0 crossing value, but you don't have any lateral information on that hole or no the lateral data, then you change it to a 1. And then there's a few other things that examples, but and then the other thing in terms of this does not exist. Huh?
There's a 0 on the crossing table
They
anymore.
changed it, they absolutely changed it.
There's no 0 on the crossing table anymore.
Well, it's just gone, but the sticker said if a crossing value is 0.
No, there's
and
no. Yeah, you're right.
lateral obstacles, you make the crossing value 1. The new guide said if there is a short 25-yard crossing, that would be a 0 crossing over
Okay.
the penalty area. No other lateral. The correct rating is 1 for lateral, not for crossing.
Okay. Oh, so saying that they flipped it in terms of where it's.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So looking at it, we'll get into that, but it looks like they took the 0 out, but there's still that yardage that's before.
Right.
It doesn't start at 0, but yeah, you're right. It does look like they got rid of that. All right, so we'll look into that more. That's a specific example later. But the other thing to keep in mind on this obstacle doesn't exist is that this applies anywhere along the line of play. So even though there might be out of bounds 25 yards right off the tee box, and then at every place you evaluate in your landing zone on the green, it's over 50. It's still a 1 because it was within 50 yards of the line of play at some point in time during the hole.
Yeah, I think the one guy explained it really good. He said, think of the hole as a 50-yard wide box. And anything that is within that 50-yard wide box, even if it doesn't come into play, is a 1.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So you got a 50 wide yard box, and anything that comes into play from the start of that hole to the end of that hole would get at least a 1.
Yeah. It just doesn't come into
Yeah.
play.
Even if it doesn't necessarily come into play in their specific landing zone. Yep. So the only exception that you would have to that, and that the thing you have to consider is when you're out there might be certain forward tees that don't have certain adjustments applied because that thing only happened before
That
the
wouldn't
hole
be part of
started.
their course. That
Right,
wouldn't be part of
right,
the yard, that would
right.
be the box.
Right, exactly. And then that's not part of the box, but that would be, someone I'm saying, hey, everyone needs to put at least a 1 on lateral because there was this penalty area just off the tee. But then if you had the forward tee and your tee and that was past it, then you wouldn't put the 1 there in that case. Yep.
So in that first example, when it says it's 70 yards, isn't that more than 50? Why is it saying 1?
So it's saying 70 for, in the example, 70 for the scratch golfer.
Short of the first landing zone. I don't know if that's the scratch above here.
It's I would imagine it's probably referencing the scratch golfer because the scratch golfer, if it's less than 100, it's no value.
The correct rating would be 1.
Right. So basically what they're saying is that it exists there. You do have to cross something, but typically it would be 0. But since there's nothing else on that hole, you're gonna get a 1 on the lateral. That's what it says, right? On the lateral.
Comes into play because there's nothing else.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll show you a few examples here. I think this is. I think we'll get to it maybe. Let me just. So when we talk about crossing here, so you have a crossing here where you have, let's just call it 70 yards for whatever, it's 70 yards across, and then you have another 70-yard crossing here, but obviously they're a lot different, right? So in this case, if you don't have anything else, what it's saying is that if you don't have anything else lateral, even though the book tells you to put a 0 here, you can't put a 0 because there's actually something there.
But if there was something there.
If there was something, let me see if I can get to. Actually, I think I can use this picture here. So this might only be 70, but there's that road in the top right. If I don't know if you can see it, but there's a road here, and so let's say that's within 50 yards. So since that's lateral, we have a value there. So then we can make this 0 because we have another value there. It's basically just making sure that it gets counted because it's there.
But something is.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure why, Gene, you said that it would fall now under lateral and not crossing, but I mean, it doesn't really make a difference one way or the other because the well, I guess it does for, yeah, the multiplier is different for bogey and scratch. So, okay. So if we run into a situation where the player can't complete the hole, this is extremely rare and maybe happens once a year, twice a year. There is a section in the guide to explain how to do that. If it comes up, talk to someone and they'll walk you through that, or it's in the guide. We're not going to spend any time to learn it because it doesn't very rarely happen. Very rarely happens. Obstacles and effective playing length corrections. So we look at obstacles separately for both the scratch and the bogey player, and on the basis where they come into play or where their landing zones are. We have a specific adjustment or a procedure. What happens when a bogey player can't reach a par 3 or a 1-shot hole? We'll rate the hole as a 2-shot hole, with the one exception that there won't be a fairway value. And this will actually be built into the form, so you'll see a 0 on that fairway there. So you don't need to worry about that, but just keep in mind that for a par 3, there is no fairway value, even if the bogey player can't get there in 2 or in 1. We have 10 obstacle factors that we look at, and each of them are evaluated on a scale of 0 to 10. And then within each of the obstacles, we have these adjustments that can go up or down. And then we also, important fact, is that we apply the adjustments in the order that they're listed. So if you're familiar looking at a book, if you've done this before, you see the adjustment page, and we would start from that first adjustment and work our way down, not jump to the last one. We do apply them in the order that they're listed. That's important. Okay. And then if it has an asterisk next to it, this means that they're shot specific. Or at least that's what the book says, Gene.
No, that doesn't mean you shot between the
Okay,
bogey and the
I'm
scratch.
just kidding. And then there's another note in here. It says that under recoverability and rough and bunkers only, shot-specific adjustments are cumulative. So you could have, example, 2 layups on a hole result in 2 L- adjustments, or for a total of -2. And likewise, you'd have that same thing with mounds, where you could have mounding in the fairway and then also mounding at the green, and that would be 2 M pluses under R&R. We typically don't do that, but there are cases where that could come into play depending on the difficulty of the hole and the landing zone of the golfers. All right, so in your book, there is a list of all the adjustments, and they're listed alphabetically. And then in the top right, it's the back page of the book. And then the top right, it lists all the obstacles and where each adjustment comes into play. So you can see that certain adjustments apply to only certain ones, but some do cross multiple obstacles. So if you're ever not sure of a certain thing applying in a certain case, this is a good reference to look at on the back of the guide.
This in the new guide, Kyle?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and it's very, very similar to the previous one. This is just updated for some of the new obstacles or changes in lettering on some of the obstacles. But it's this is from the new guide. This picture here.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right. And then in terms of obstacles, we should have a rating of 0 when the obstacle doesn't exist. So we talked about excuse me, we talked about that. And then obstacle ratings of 3, 4, and 5 would be expected about half the time on an average golf course. Okay, and then a rating of 10 would normally be expected on less than 1% of the holes. So if we do rating at in 9 holes for a rate, you'd have to rate 11 golf courses in order for you to have to put a 10 on your sheet. That's the frequency you should think of using a 10. So if you use a 10 more than that, then I'll introduce you to my friend P- in a little bit. And then some certain obstacles cannot be 0. So there's a built-in minimum. So for fairway, we have an R&R, we have a minimum of 1. For green target, we have a minimum of 2. And in the green surface, there's a minimum of 3. Okay, and then we also are assuming that that people are playing according to the rules of golf. So we're not rating for the people that play by their own rules or don't play by the rules, or rating for people that play by the rules and post their scores. So that's, I mean, it doesn't come up a ton, but it is important to understand that. All right, weighting and percentage adjustments.
Put your score in.
Sorry? Oh, no, that's someone else. Okay. All right, so weighting and percentage adjustments. So sometimes an obstacle such as topography is not uniform throughout the landing zone. Okay, so this is a good example. Part of the fairway landing zone has only a minor stance problem, while the rest is significantly awkward. In these situations, do not rate for the most severe condition. Instead, determine a weighted average of the varying conditions and apply the average to the rating table. Or rate the various conditions and take a weighted average. So an example, if 3/4 of the fairway is minor stance problems with the green 10 feet uphill, which turns into a rate of 2, and 1/4 of the fairway has significantly awkward stance with 20 feet uphill, which is a 6, then our final total should be a rating of 3, not assuming the worst. So if we see a big mogul or whatever in the middle of the fairway, we don't automatically rate it a 6. We think about where golf balls are going to come up and the frequency of them coming into play for that certain difficult part of the fairway. This is just one example. There's other examples, but I think a good one.
Average. If 3/4 of that value would be 2 and 1/4 6, they're averaging, but it's on a weighted basis.
Right. Yeah. So 0.75 times.
6 divided by 2 is 8. You have
Yeah.
2 taken 3 times and 6 once. 12 divided by 4 is 3.
But they're not averaging multiple landing zones. Like your first
Yeah.
landing
No.
zone
Right.
is
Right. Yeah.
2,
exactly.
And your next landing zone is literally a 6.
Yeah,
because
this-
it's horrible.
Right.
You
Correct.
still take the highest one.
Correct. Yeah. So this is, that's a good point of clarification, Patty, is that this is talking about within one landing zone, not multiple landing zones. In multiple landing zones, you would take the higher one in that case, which we do with a couple obstacles. Yep. Yeah, Rick.
But it is topography, so it's the shot to the green.
Topography, the elevation is when we look at the shot to the green. We are looking at the actual level of topography at every landing zone, but we're only looking at the shot to the green, or the elevation for the shot to the green. All right, and then percentage adjustment. We learned that this is now, they're recommending increments of 25%. So you adjust down. Percentage adjustment is always down. And so it adjusts down in 25, 50, 75%. I was last November, I was at a USGA thing that they have all these associations, and they said that the course sharing people said that the P adjustment is the most important adjustment in the system. And that is one that needs to be used in order to properly to get the right outcome. And this will apply to force carries, lateral obstacles. And I have just one example that I can think of that is just very, very easy for me to understand as we have this carry again here. So we have a carrying or a crossing, whatever we want to call it. And we have here where we go from the tee all the way to the green. And so we have water the entire way, pretty much. And then this one, we have the same exact numbers. So let's say the number 70 or whatever the number is, 100. But we have the same number for the crossing because the water is at this point here and our tee is back here. So it's still 100 yards, but you can't logically tell me that this value should be the same as this value, because there is a much higher probability of you hitting in the water on this shot than there is this one. And so by default, we need to P minus this because there's so much other things that could happen, and the water is only a percentage of what it is for here, even though the book tells us that at 100 yards, this should be the same. So if we don't apply that P adjustment, these get the same exact value, which is not right.
Well, that's going to depend too on the player and their shot length. Of course.
Sure.
I mean, for a bogey woman golfer, 100 yards, that's only 10 yards less than her maximum carry.
Right.
You know, so on a second shot, and so that still should be the full amount.
Well, that's your interpretation. So so I would argue that, and I'm not saying it's wrong or right. I would just argue that, you know, if I'm a bogey golfer, I'm going to hit a lot of squirrely shots, and they might not always be, you know, perfect 150 or whatever, 130. And if I chunk one here, that's in the drink. If I chunk one here, I live to fight another day. And so I can't.
Yeah, but your target is your destination, which is 10 yards over that creek.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean,
It's supposed to be how hard the hole is, right? So your shot is king. You hit 100 shots on both holes. It's going to be, your number is going to be higher off the previous one because you're going to put more in the water with dispersion than you would here.
well, depending on who you are, yes.
No.
Well,
Everybody.
No, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think there's it kind of goes back to when we think about that you know, dispersion chart that we saw. There's not only left and right, but there's short and long, and that in some cases, you know, that shorter one, you know, would end up in the water in some cases, and it's all a judgment in terms of what you're doing. And if you have a scenario where that is right on the edge of where they're carrying, then yeah, you could probably make the argument that it should be the full value. But I mean, I would say that, let's say this is a 5 for your golfer, and make this a 5 and make this a 4, because to me, these are two completely different. Yeah. But so anyways, that's just one example of a percentage adjustment where you could apply it. The other one could be if you're hitting into an area of tall grass, and in certain places it's really, really thick, and in other places it's not thick at all. And so you might say, well, I can play out of this. So even though it's got red stakes around it, I'm going to be able to hit it out of here 50% of the time. And so I'm going to do a 50% P adjustment on that number. And that would be the same thing if you had, I mean, we've all been in a scenario where, you know, if we hit it in the water, we're not going to get it. We're not going to be able to hit it out of there. Maybe if it's on the edge, but if it's in the middle of the pond, we can't hit it. But if it's in the middle of the forest, the trees, you know, there's a chance that we can hit it. Maybe there's not a 25% chance. Maybe we don't P minus it. But if there's a lot of these heather type areas, there are places where you can play it out of there and find it. And so that's why using the P adjustment there would be appropriate, because it's not in the bottom of the pond. There's a chance that you can play it. All right. I think that let me just, I got one more and then we'll be done for the day. So now the last thing we'll talk about is obstacles behind the green. And these are generally less important than those of a similar nature to the side or the front of the green. So the following points should be considered when rating obstacles behind the green. Statistically, less than 10% of approach shots will finish over the green, based on the USGA's data. On long shots, the ball lands short of the target, bringing obstacles in front of the green more in play than those behind. Okay, and then when the green falls into the transition zone, the player normally cannot hit the ball far enough to reach obstacles behind the green. Okay, and then obstacles that exist only behind the green should be downgraded in the rating process by applying either the -1B bounce adjustment and possibly the percentage adjustment. So again, this is just based on shot data. And if you think about your own game as well, whatever type of golfer you are, when you hit your shots, you know, where do the majority of your misses go? They're short, and that's the reason when we're doing our tournaments for events that either our net events or junior events that have our higher handicappers, the hardest hole location is always the front of the green, because everyone thinks they get 154 yards and I'm going to hit it exactly 154 yards and not any longer, and all their shots are short because they don't hit it perfect every single time, and they end up short. And so that's what this is saying, is that if something is behind the green, we're going to discount it because it doesn't come into play, because people don't hit there as much or as frequently as they do middle of the green.
Another thought to think about, though, is what's at the front of the green, and is that person trying to avoid that, so they're hitting it longer.
Right.
So, I mean, that is a scenario that comes into play that has to be looked at when you're downgrading.
Yeah. So you may not always downgrade it if you have a carry that you're purposely trying to hit over. Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. That could definitely be the case. All right. We'll pick up next time with effective playing length corrections and get into these actual tabs. So I appreciate everyone coming out. This presentation will be online, the actual presentation, the video as well. And we look forward to seeing everyone next time.
Hey, Kyle, this is Joe Bolter. Question on when we were talking about obstacles earlier. We said we consider obstacles regardless of where they are going down the length of the court or the length of the hole.